Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Asian equities surge with Hong Kong and mainland China extending gains sparked by Beijing's fresh support measures. Israel carries out more airstrikes against Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. The deadliest bombardment since 2006 has killed more than 550 people, including 50 children. Plus, surprise hike. Nigeria shocks markets with a 50 basis point rate increase, bucking the global easing trend as it tries to stamp out inflation. Well, good morning again, everybody. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. It is 5 a.m. in the UK, nice and early. I'm Nomura Asset in London, getting you caught up to speed because the market has drunk a little bit of that China Kool-Aid. So what we have seen is quite a sustained rally since that China stimulus package came through 24 hours ago. Very strong session for Chinese markets. We'll get to that shortly. But today you can see S&P futures are leaning slightly towards the red. This after making, you got it, yet another record high. This is the 41st record high for the S&P this year. Keeps going from strength to strength. Keeping a close eye on the dollar as well, because we have been slipping, most notably again versus the renminbi, which has actually broken through or got close to 7 for the first time in about 15, 16 months. So strength in the renminbi is coming through. That is one of the themes that's playing out. But of course, the dollar is losing ground versus the Aussie dollar, as we saw yesterday, that hawkish bias from the RBA amidst other developed market currencies as well. So the dollar weakness theme is continuing. Brent also sitting at around $75 as we've been talking about the last couple of days. Oil has steadied. Traders are focused on the developments in the Middle East. But then, of course, the impact on demand from China's stimulus measures has been a big driver across all financial assets, not just equities, that China stimulus package. And then as we head into the European session, we also want to keep a close eye on the MSCI Emerging Markets Index because it has seen a lot of strength and a big rebound since that China stimulus package came through. So up 1.9%. Also, just want to draw your attention as well to what's been happening with the so-called safe haven metals. We have gold once again at a record high. It jumped 1% yesterday. And again, this has been bolstered by rate cut expectations from the Fed as in reaction to that 50 basis point cut last week. But then also keep a close eye on silver as well. Some people call silver gold's cousin, but essentially silver has also kept up with the rally. Not quite at record highs, but getting close to it. And for the year, up 35%. So those are how those safe haven assets are doing. But let's see how Asian markets are faring as well. Min Lau joins me from Hong Kong. Min, very strong reaction in some of these Chinese equities overnight. Just bring us up to speed on what we're seeing this morning.
Yes, Asian markets still surging for a second day after the PBOC announced that mini bazooka package of stimulus, up 1.6% for the Asian benchmark. The Nikkei seeing decent gains, but everything is really outpaced by the performance of the Chinese markets, right? That liquidity boost to the Chinese stock market really broadening out to the commodities, your iron ore, gold, copper, all rebounding today, and Asian currencies as well, getting a boost partly because of the weakness in U.S. consumer sentiment, the Fed leaving the door open for more rate cuts later this year. So across the board, Asian currencies largely on the upside, but the yen going the opposite direction. We're really seeing the yen rally losing momentum after the Fed move. But flip the board, take a look at the China markets. That's where the story is. We're seeing the CSI 300 briefly erasing year-to-date gains, year-to-date losses, I should say, so far this year. It took us quite a while to get here. We're back to square one again. The Hang Seng China Index seeing the longest streak of gains in 6 years. And take a look at the dollar yuan that briefly breached below the key 7 level earlier today. The last time we saw that was back in May 2023. And that's really something to watch, how much momentum is behind that, because many Chinese exporters have been holding on to huge amounts of dollars. This might be the tipping point for them to start unwinding their position to avoid losses here.
Min, thank you so much for the overview. That was Min Lau in Hong Kong. Now, Israel has carried out more airstrikes on Hezbollah targets in its heaviest and deadliest bombardment on Lebanon since the 2006 war. Lebanese officials say these strikes have so far killed at least 558 people, including 50 children. The Israeli military says senior Hezbollah commander Ibrahim Mohammed Kabisi has been killed in a Beirut airstrike. The IDF says it has hit around 1,600 Hezbollah targets, including rocket launchers, command posts, and other infrastructure. Meanwhile, Iran's president condemned Israel's actions during his United Nations General Assembly speech.
We condemn Israeli crimes against humanity. It is imperative that the international community should immediately stop the violence and bring about a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and bring an end to the desperate barbarism of Israel in Lebanon before it engulfs the region and the world.
Let's bring in Burcu Ozcelik, Senior Research Fellow of Middle East Security at RUSI. Good to have you with us on the show. Thank you for joining us this morning. Let me just ask you what you see happening now in this war that is kicked off between Israel and Hezbollah, but also with seeing a very high civilian casualty count as well within Lebanon. Where do you see things going from here? And do you actually see the possibility of a ground offensive?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think we are at a very worrisome moment in the wider war that's been ongoing now for almost a year. Significant escalation in the past week and certainly over the past few days. From the Israeli perspective, I think the strategy, if there is one, is that this is a bid to escalate in order to de-escalate the situation. That this is the opening of an offensive into southern Lebanon in order to create leverage and coerce Hezbollah into effectively surrendering and moving its forces further up north beyond the Litani River. The casualty toll is rising. Civilians in southern Lebanon fleeing north to Beirut and beyond. This is a far more concerning situation now in a shorter amount of time than what we saw in 2006. In terms of where we could go next, there has been various discussions at the UN General Assembly meetings in New York. As you mentioned, there seems to be an opening, clearly a desirability to find a diplomatic solution to the ongoing crisis and to avoid serious escalation that would bring in Lebanon to a far more lethal extent into this war. But without a ceasefire in Gaza, this seems very unlikely to create a real change in certain conditions on the ground at the moment.
So that was going to be my next question. When Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, gave the speech last week, and this was before Friday's airstrikes, he explicitly drew a link between the actions in Lebanon and the ongoing war in Gaza as well. So the first time he was very explicit about it. And now the rhetoric has changed towards they're defending Lebanon. This is the official language that is being used by some of the speakers on behalf of Hezbollah in the last couple of days. My question is, what would incentivize Hezbollah at this point to compromise and to put down their arms and maybe to take up something similar to Resolution 1701? What would be the catalyst for that? Would it have to be pressure coming from Iran? Is it the international community? Or is it just simply that they see that their capabilities have been so far so much degraded that they don't have the leverage that they used to have anymore?
I think it's a combination of those factors, as is always the case. There would need to be, I believe, pressure from Iran to de-escalate, to back down. But that raises the very valid question of the extent to which Iran yields influence over Hezbollah, which is extensive. But that's not to say that Hezbollah is not also an actor that has its own command and control centers. That said, Hezbollah has experienced a severe degradation in its capabilities, in its communication systems, in the morale, certainly, over the past week. These have been significant blows to Hezbollah's strike capacity. Its arsenal of weapons in the south of Lebanon are under constant attack now. by Israeli forces. So in terms of what would incentivize Hezbollah, this is probably a question about when they decide that they are near breaking point, that it's no longer in their interest to continue fighting. And it's not clear when that decision will be taken, but the IDF, Israeli security establishment, seems intent to pushing this further until we get to that moment in time. What's interesting is that in his speech to the UN General Assembly yesterday, Iranian President Pezeshkian was very unusually conciliatory in his tone, in his rhetoric to the Western audience, indicating a willingness to re-engage with the West, to reopen a new chapter in negotiations, to effectively reset the relationship. And of course, this is a speech that could be seen as somewhat promising in a very desperate and grim time for the Middle East. But it's also a posture from Iran's perspective that is very contradictory, given what's happening on the ground and the support, the funding for various factions within the so-called axis of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people were watching that speech at the UN General Assembly very closely. I just want to bring our viewers up to speed with some breaking news also that has just crossed in the last 15, 20 minutes. A missile from Lebanon was intercepted after Tel Aviv sirens went off. So it appears as though a missile directed from Lebanon into Tel Aviv has actually been intercepted. Getting and awaiting more details here, but that would be another quite significant escalation because this time it's Tel Aviv itself that was attempted to be targeted. Burcu, I just want to come back to you. What do you think would be the catalyst for the Israeli military to take it one step further? And would something like this actually constitute as a catalyst for that potential ground invasion?
I think the catalyst for the ground invasion would be an assessment by the Israeli forces that the aerial campaign is not achieving the results that they are aiming for in the short term. I don't think that a ground invasion will necessarily be to the advantage of Israel. And that's likely a strategic calculation that they are making very, very closely. But of course, with potential attacks deeper inside Israel, as far as Tel Aviv, if that were to create civilian casualties on the Israeli side, that could be used as a justification to escalate. Deeper inside Lebanon, attacks as far as Beirut against Hezbollah targets. And that could potentially trigger at least a more limited ground campaign in the first instance to establish a sort of a buffer zone or security zone in the southern part of Lebanon, which is something that certain Israeli government officials have been lobbying for some time.
Yeah. Burcu Ozcelik, a senior research fellow of Middle East security at RUSI, thank you so much. And just as a recap, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, did say they had intercepted a surface-to-surface missile crossing from Lebanon following sirens in Tel Aviv, which could be construed as quite a serious escalation. The first time, I believe, since the Gaza war, that a rocket directly fired at Tel Aviv has been intercepted coming from Lebanon. Now, still ahead, we will get the market outlook with Nomura Asset Management as investors look to more easing by the Fed while weighing China's efforts to shore up recovery. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Versace in London. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva says U.S. monetary policy has cooled inflation without tipping the economy into recession. She also told Bloomberg the world's biggest economy is helping support global growth as other nations slow down.
We are in a very good place. We have been predicting soft landing. We would see inflation down and growth still remaining firmly in positive territory. This is where we are.
Right.
We know that in the services, inflation is still flaring a little bit more, so the Fed is going to watch it. But broadly, we think that the Fed got it right.
Let's bring in Tarek Fadlallah, Middle East CEO at Nomura Asset Management. Good to have you with us on the show today, Tarek. Picking up from some of Georgieva's comments there, she seems to be, actually commending the Fed, saying that central banks have done their job, inflation is coming down, the Fed has got it right. So if she's right in that central banks have succeeded at taming inflation, are interest rates around the world just not too high right now then? Are they not in too much of a restrictive territory?
Yes, good morning, Jemana. That's a good question. And the surprise 50 basis point cut by the Fed raises questions around, what they think about the economy as well as the inflation outlook. They're clearly more optimistic, shall we say, about the fact that inflation may be tamed. I think in the short term, they might be right. Clearly, we're seeing numbers that are significantly below where the Fed funds rate is. So there appears to be scope, and maybe considerable scope, to cut interest rates into next year. But this is reliant on the fact that inflation is indeed beaten. And I'm not so sure that that's the case. We still see elevated inflation numbers in the service sectors, as was mentioned. We're also seeing commodity prices beginning to bubble up. So there are reasons to be cautious in the medium term, but at face value, it does seem as though we're going to see cuts, and significant cuts, into next year.
Yeah, what do you think is the biggest driver for markets right now? Is it the Fed cutting 50 basis points, or is it this bazooka package that was unveiled by the PBOC yesterday?
Well, a bit of both. It's worth mentioning that the US Fed funds rate is the single most important interest rate benchmark globally for financial markets as well as for economies, particularly emerging market economies. And of course, in the region here, in the GCC, due to the dollar peg, we are completely influenced by US interest rates. So the fact that US interest rates are coming down is positive across the emerging markets. And what we've heard out of China in the last 24, 48 hours is equally positive for those markets. S&P
tracking, let's say, just shy of 5,800 now, another record high for the year. I noted that Goldman Sachs' David Kostin sees S&P 500 reaching 6,000 next year. Do you share that optimism? Do you think that these stock markets can continue to go from strength to strength?
Look, the stock market in the last 12 months has surprised everybody. If you go back to the end of last year and look at the forecast for the S&P 500, I'm pretty sure nobody had 5,800 or 6,000 as their number for the S&P as of the end of this year. So there's clearly been a much stronger stock market than anyone had expected. I don't expect the markets to be significantly stronger next year. I personally think that the markets will actually be lower next year due to the slowing economy. But look, the market's done very well. It is expensive on historic measures, and profits continue to rise. So until we see some inflection point in either the macroeconomic data or the profitability data, the markets will continue to chug along. Yeah. It certainly appears to be the case. Tarek, thank you so much for joining us today. Tarek Fadlallah, Middle East CEO at Nomura Asset Management. Well, coming up, Saudi Aramco is looking to raise $3 billion in its second bond offering in 2 months. We are live in Riyadh next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersachi in London. Aramco is said to be looking to raise $3 billion in its second international bond offering in 2 months, the latest deal in the kingdom's debt spree this year. The state-run oil company has hired banks for the dollar-denominated debt. Let's bring in Bloomberg Saudi Bureau Chief, friend of the program, Christine Burke, who joins me from Riyadh. Christine, this would be their second bond issuance this year. Back in July, they issued $6 billion for the first time in 3 years. What is going on with Aramco and the debt issuance? Why is this all happening now?
Well, you're right in that Aramco has been quite active when it comes to the international debt capital markets. You mentioned that we are going to see this second dollar-denominated bond sale that comes after that $6 billion sale that you mentioned. And that sale that happened in July was actually the first time that we've seen Aramco do a dollar debt deal since 2021. So it is a good question to ask why we're doing this now. And I think it really probably comes down to two key things. The first is that we are seeing lower oil prices. So Brent is down about 3% or so far this year, trading around $75 a barrel. And when we look back to Aramco's second quarter earnings, we can see that lower oil prices and, of course, lower oil production under that OPEC plus supply policy has been acting as a drag on profits. The second key thing is dividends. Remember, Aramco pays hefty dividends. Its dividend program this year is $124 billion. Its quarterly dividend for the second quarter was $31 billion. And when we look at free cash flow, it only came in at $19 billion. So clearly free cash flow is not enough to cover the dividends. And so it's likely that the company probably needs to borrow in order to support that dividend program. And remember, those dividends are so crucial for the government. The government is facing budget deficits, and it needs those dividends in order to sort of help cushion and create a fiscal buffer, if you will.
It is interesting. The dividend point is a very valid one, and you've got to wonder how long that is going to be sustained for, borrowing to pay out dividends. But that's a different question. More generally speaking, though, there has been quite a lot of activity in terms of bond issuances. It's not just Aramco. PIF has also issued, ADNOC. So it seems as though the bond profile picture in the region has been picking up as of late.
Yeah, it's so true. It's actually quite remarkable, Jumana. And when you think about it, Aramco may actually be the least active. So when you look at the Saudi government, it is actually a leading issuer of sovereign debt among emerging markets. So much so that we may actually see the country break its own record and sell $21.5 billion in euro bonds this year. That was a record that was set in 2017. But we are tracking towards potentially breaking that. You mentioned the PIF, and yes, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. This is the most active that we have ever seen them. They sold $2 billion of bonds at the start of September, and that was on top of more than $7.5 billion that has already been raised this year. And beyond that, you also look at Saudi banks, and they are also diversifying their funding mix and relying more heavily on debt capital markets. So you take all those things together, and then you add this latest Aramco sale, and it's pretty clear that we are looking at a country that is in a position of strong funding needs. Of course, a lot of that coming down to the Vision 2030 diversification agenda, and the fact that that is requiring huge sums of investment at a time when oil prices are low and the Saudi government is facing at least 3 more years of budget deficits.
Yeah, thank you for giving us the broader context. Bloomberg's Saudi Bureau Chief, Christine Burke, thank you so much. Well, coming up, world leaders at the UN General Assembly call for de-escalation in the Middle East as Israel conducts more strikes in Lebanon, forcing thousands to flee their homes. More on the situation on the ground next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Asian equities surge with Hong Kong and mainland China extending gains sparked by Beijing's fresh support measures. Israel carries out more airstrikes against Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. The deadliest bombardment since 2006 has killed more than 550 people, including 50 children. Plus, a surprise hike. Nigeria shocks markets with a 50 basis point rate increase, bucking the global easing trend as it tries to stamp out inflation. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates, 5:30 a.m. over here in the UK. I'm Jumana Bersachi in London. And as we were just speaking about, the markets seem to be reacting very well to that China stimulus package unveiled yesterday. For now, you can see S&P futures are trading slightly towards the red, down about 0.1%. But this on back of yet another record high for the U.S. stock market, a 41st record high for the year yesterday. The USD also seeing a bit of of losses this morning, down about 8 basis points, slipping versus the yuan, keeping a close eye on that currency pair versus other pairs currencies as well. The Aussie dollar also gaining some strength versus the USD. So the theme for the US dollar the last couple of weeks or so has been one of weakness. Brent sitting around $75, underpinned by a couple of factors. You could say, on one hand, the demand picture looks slightly better after that stimulus package unveiled by China, but then equally keeping a close eye on the situation in the Middle East as well. And emerging markets have seen a good run the last 24 hours too, slipping since where we were just half an hour ago, but the MSCI Emerging Markets Index now up 0.9%. Also, just want to draw your attention to what's been happening with gold and silver. Gold yet at another record high, up 30% on the year. Silver also getting close to record highs, up 35%. So these safe haven assets seem to be doing quite well as the market prices in further easing out of the Fed. But let's check in further on how Asian markets are faring. Min Min Lo joins us from Hong Kong. Min Min, just bring us up to speed.
Yeah, we've had a little bit more than 24 hours to digest that stimulus package from the PBOC, and maybe it's a sign of a little bit of doubt seeping in among traders here, because we did see the Asian benchmark surging up some 1.5% earlier this morning, but we've pared back quite significantly. The gains now just at 0.7%, and the same thing with the CSI 300. It was up some 3.4% earlier this morning. That's come down a little bit now, but still in the green. If you flip the board, we are seeing emerging market currencies surging to fresh record highs today on the back of the weakness in U.S. consumer sentiment, the Fed leaving the door open for more rate cuts. That's giving a shot in the arm for many of these Asian currencies, although the yen is moving in the opposite direction. It's the yen really losing a bit of momentum after the Fed move. Take a look at the China markets. That's where the China story is. The CSI 300 briefly erased year-to-date losses so far, but if you take a look at the year-to-date chart, it's still now back in the red again. So how sustainable is this momentum is the big question here. The 10-year yield hit fresh record low of 2% yesterday, but now it's backed up a little bit. 2.05 is the handle here, 2.05%, and analysts are saying that there is still further downside to the 10-year yield on the expectation that the government could ease monetary policy further later this quarter.
Yeah, well, it's been quite the impressive rebound since the lows reached earlier this month. Min Min Lo, thank you so much for giving us the overview. Now, speeches by world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly have widely called for de-escalation in the Middle East. Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, defended Israel's military strikes in Lebanon, saying they are necessary to protect Israeli civilians, while Iran's president called on Israel's allies to end what he described as a horrific catastrophe.
We will continue to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities. We will continue to push Hezbollah terrorists back to the Litani River, and we will continue to work towards returning the people of the North to their homes.
The responsibility for all consequences will be borne by those governments who have thwarted all global efforts to end this horrific catastrophe and have the audacity to call themselves champions of human rights.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's UAE Bureau Chief Dan Khreish and Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Dan, I'm going to start with you. Just bring us up to speed on, once again, what has been happening on the ground in Lebanon. More airstrikes in the last 24 hours. Hezbollah confirming that yet another senior military commander has also been killed.
Yes, good morning. So we saw yesterday Israel carrying out more airstrikes on Hezbollah targets in South Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, and the death toll continues rising there. About over 500 people killed and thousands of injuries. Now, this is becoming a burden, of course, on a country that's still reeling from its worst economic crisis since 2019, and the government really doesn't have enough funds to face this or the infrastructure necessary. So we saw people still leaving and fleeing the airstrikes in the south and the Bekaa Valley. Some of them have actually crossed into Syria. Some maybe have family members there or just setting up tents to stay along the border. We saw that the government had opened up about 250 schools and other government buildings to house what they say are about 26,000 people who have left, and these are only the registered. There are still people stuck actually on the road. Yesterday we saw someone saying that they've been on the road from South Lebanon to Beirut for about 17 hours. The road leading to Beirut, the big highway, is very much jammed. So this is becoming a humanitarian catastrophe for Lebanon as well. And we saw this morning that there was a missile strike in the center of Tel Aviv, and that is huge news. And it seems Hezbollah is now upping and ramping up its own strikes. Yesterday, they fired about 16 separate attacks on Israel. They say it's military targets, but what we're seeing is sirens were sounding in civilian areas in northern Israel.
Yeah, Dana, let me pick up on that because this was quite significant breaking news that came out just in the last half an hour. For viewers who are not up to speed, the IDF has said that they have intercepted a missile from Lebanon following Tel Aviv sirens. So, Dan, just give us this perspective from Israel and how the military will be viewing this, because I believe it is the first time that there has been some missile directed towards Tel Aviv since the beginning of this war in Gaza.
Yes, good morning. That would be correct. This will certainly be viewed by Israel potentially as a red line that could draw further escalation, potentially intensified Israeli attacks in or around Beirut itself. What we know for now, it was a surface-to-surface missile that was intercepted in Israel, but Israel has a very sophisticated early alert system which set off sirens in Tel Aviv and a city north of Tel Aviv, indicating that was the intended target. Heretofore, Hezbollah had not tried to attack what is Israel's commercial capital, effectively this coastal metropolis. There were unwritten rules demarcating even the surge of the conflict to Haifa port in the north, surrounding towns, and mostly southern Lebanon with a couple of what Israel described as precision strikes in Beirut. We may now see that situation change entirely.
Dan, what are people in Israel, what is the Israeli military saying about the possibility of a ground offensive? I know this question has been put to many officials in the last few days, but what are you hearing and what are you sensing on the ground? Is this a possibility, a real possibility of a ground offensive into Lebanon?
Israel is certainly signaling that it's possible. Keep in mind that this Israeli offensive, or actually an Israeli counteroffensive in Lebanon, has been in the works since October 8th. When Hezbollah started attacking Israel in solidarity with Hamas, Hamas being the Palestinian group that rules Gaza, and attacked Israel the day before launching the ongoing Gaza war. So the Israelis have had months to prepare this. They've clearly had very sophisticated intelligence in Lebanon that have allowed them a range of attacks, standoff attacks over the last week. However, their approach, as stated by the Israeli ambassador to the UN, is they will do what is necessary to end the Hezbollah threat, not just in terms of missile capabilities held by Hezbollah, but the Hezbollah presence near the Lebanon border with Israel. So the Israeli signaling is if Hezbollah does not cease and desist, they can go in on the ground. The Israeli defense minister inspected troops yesterday who are actually simulating combat in Lebanon. I don't think there's any appetite in Israel for a full second front to the Gaza war. Clearly, invading Lebanon would be a very different story to invading Gaza. It's bigger. Hezbollah is very much battle-tested from the fighting in Syria over the last decade. And also, Israel cannot claim to control Lebanon from all sides as it can in Gaza, meaning that presumably Hezbollah would still have open supply lines to regroup and rearm. I don't think there's much appetite for that in Israel. However, Israelis do want to stop the Hezbollah threat from Lebanon.
Yeah, and all eyes, of course, will be on the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly later this week. Dana, let's just pick up on some of the speeches we got yesterday, because there was a lot of scrutiny and focus being paid to what the Iranian president had to say, Pezeshkian, his first opportunity to actually speak to the UN since he was appointed as president. What did we learn from what he had to say?
Yes, so we saw Iran's president making his first speech at the UN General Assembly. This is significant for him. This is his first speech to the world since he was elected president. Now, he repeated the same lines on Israel, that Israel must stop its attacks on Gaza and, of course, Lebanon. But they've also a couple of, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago, said that they were ready to ease and de-escalate tensions with Israel. And that is the thing that everyone is focusing on today. Would that happen? Can the U.S. and Iran sit again together and discuss the nuclear file and potentially de-escalate tensions in the region? Because, you know, Iran is supporting groups like Hamas and definitely Hezbollah. We saw the Lebanese officials are probably betting on the success or a success from U.S. mediation that are still being held by Amos Hochstein, and this is the U.S. President Biden's envoy to the region. He was in the region a few weeks ago, and there seems to be from some Lebanese local media that he is still trying to mediate and de-escalate the attacks on Lebanon. And we saw that Prime Minister Najib Mikati had postponed his trip to New York, but then he left again yesterday under the saying that he wants to join the Arab foreign ministers meeting that would discuss the situation in Lebanon, and probably thinks that it is best for him to be there to personally talk about Lebanon and potentially de-escalate the tensions. And of course, the Lebanese line is that they are committed to the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that ended the war in 2006. And they're betting that if there is a mediation effort, then they can implement the resolution. And that would mean Hezbollah withdrawing from border areas near Israel.
Yeah. Well, that is the question. Dana Khrish and Dan Williams, thank you so much for your reporting. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following today. OPEC has doubled down on forecasts that global oil demand will keep growing until 2050. The group's view is an outlier amongst major industry forecasters, and scientists say it will lead to a climate catastrophe. This highly bullish outlook on long-term oil demand is driven by growth in the developing world. Hedge funds now employ more than 1,000 people in Dubai. An influx of some of the world's biggest investment vehicles, including Millennium and Balyazny, are burnishing the city's credentials as an emerging hub for the sector. Dubai's International Financial Center, the DIFC, has also seen employee numbers surge by 2/3 since 2019 as a record number of firms move to the city. And Abu Dhabi's Masdar has agreed to buy Spanish renewables firm Saita Yield from Brookfield Asset Management. The Abu Dhabi-based company is targeting investments in 100 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. The state-owned company announced separate clean energy deals late last year in Spain and Germany. And coming up, Nigeria's central bank surprises markets by hiking rates to a record. More on what is behind the move next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersachi in London. The Central Bank of Nigeria surprised financial markets by raising borrowing costs to a fresh record high of 27.25%. The Monetary Policy Committee says the half-point hike aims to quell inflation, support the naira, and attract investment. So for more on this, Bloomberg's Ondiro Ganga joins us now. This was a total surprise, it seems, to the market. Not many people were expecting the Nigerian Central Bank to hike interest rates. What do you make of it?
Jumana, as you mentioned earlier on, inflation remains a point of concern for the Nigerian economy, and the central bank governor Olayemi Cardoso says that they're not yet out of the woods, and hence the core focus of MPC would be to bring inflation down. And this is despite the fact that inflation has cooled from about 34.2%, where it peaked, to 32.2%, but it was largely due to base effects. And one can say that Nigeria has been hit by a perfect storm. Fuel prices are up 45% because the government is making another attempt at removing 7 subsidies. Food-producing regions have been hit by devastating floods. And also, this is a country where the naira remains very volatile, despite efforts to stabilize it. Also, if you look at other things like energy, they've remained a point of concern, increasing food prices, increasing transport prices. And the central bank is hoping that the Dangote refinery will be able to bring some relief in that regard. And they're also hoping that it will ease dollar demand to import refined petroleum products into the country, hence reflecting positively on external reserves and also overall balance of payments.
Given that this was such a surprise, and given that the central bank really didn't telegraph this well, how did markets react to it on Diro?
On the contrary, Jumana, markets reacted quite positively. Nigerian bonds were up 0.8%. Trading at about 84.8 cents. And also the Nigerian sovereign bonds were among the best performing in the emerging markets. But this hike, again, comes as a surprise because other banks have begun their cut cycle, the Federal Reserve in the US, South African Central Bank, and those that are not cutting are opting to hold. But that's not going to be the case in Nigeria. Over the next 3 meetings, Bloomberg economists are expecting a cut of about 150 basis points to try and bring inflation to under 30% in the first quarter of 2025. And this is with the hope that it will draw local currency into the debt market, hence helping stabilize the naira to some extent.
Andiro, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. Andiro Aganga from Kigali. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following this morning. Africa's richest person, Aliko Dangote, is planning to open a family office in Dubai. He's set to join other high net worth individuals who are flocking to the financial hub. The Nigerian billionaire is seeking out global investments in the Middle East to diversify the group's holdings beyond industrials. Chevron paid more to African petrostates than to the U.S. government last year. The company paid over $6 billion in taxes to Nigeria, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea, 3 times more than the U.S. received. It's the first time Chevron has revealed the figures after a 2020 section of the Dodd-Frank Act required their release by this week. President Biden is planning to visit Africa, fulfilling a promise to visit the continent before he leaves office. He is set to travel to Angola next month after a stop in Germany. The visits highlight 2 of the Biden's priorities, maintaining and strengthening ties with allies in Europe and expanding U.S. economic links with Africa. Coming up, mega-rich investors from the Middle East are pumping a record amount of money into China. We are live in Hong Kong with the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in London. Cash-rich Middle Eastern investors are pumping a record amount of money into China. Saudi Aramco, along with sovereign wealth funds, have been moving into Chinese assets as other global firms retreat amid economic uncertainty. Let's bring in our Asia Equity Capital Markets reporter, Julia Fiorati, who joins us from Hong Kong. Julia, it's good to have you with us. So why are Middle Eastern investors deploying money into China at a time when investors from around the world have actually been pulling back?
Well, Jumana, it comes down to the diversification drive that we're seeing in the Middle East and particularly in the Gulf. Those economies are trying to diversify their economies away from oil and petrochemicals. And because of that, they need to invest basically in other sectors. They're trying to build up tourism, infrastructure, manufacturing, automotive as well. And obviously, China has a lot of leaders in these sectors, and the Chinese companies are hungry for cash. And so they're looking, it's often a quid pro quo, whereby the Chinese companies get the investment, but in return, they have to invest in the Middle Eastern economies to help build up their manufacturing capabilities in sectors such as tech and AI and petrochemical, and automotive as well. So it's part of the diversification drive.
Yeah, I mean, typically, before we saw a significant uptick in geopolitical tensions, Chinese companies would have traditionally sought capital from the U.S. and Europe. Obviously, things have changed in the last couple of years. But what is it specifically that's in for these Chinese companies, given the Middle East is now setting their sights on some of them?
Well, you're exactly right. They typically went to the US. Obviously, US IPOs by Chinese companies used to be very hot a few years ago. That's obviously now stopped. They're hungry for cash precisely because investments from Western economies have really dried up and investors have been pulling money out of China. Chinese companies still need investment. They still need to expand and get cash. And so obviously the Middle East with its deep pockets is a perfect avenue for this. The Middle East is also less sensitive than perhaps the West in terms of the geopolitics. They seem to be more neutral. And so that's why we have seen this this closening between China and the Middle East.
Are there any specific sectors that Middle Eastern investors are targeting?
There are a few specific sectors, yes. Basically, they're looking obviously at tech and high-end manufacturing. For example, earlier this year, at the beginning of, towards the beginning of the summer, the PIF invested $2 billion in a convertible bond issued by China's Lenovo. So obviously, tech and high-end tech is one sector that they're very interested in. We've also seen deals in the automotive sector. We've seen deals. Aramco has been buying stakes in petrochemical companies in China. So, and also obviously we've seen infrastructure deals as well. So it's a lot of these newer sectors that they're targeting.
Yeah, makes sense. So Bloomberg's Julia Fioretti, great to have you with us on the show. Thank you for bringing us that story. Now for a look at some other stories we're following this morning. Germany's Commerzbank has named Bettina Orlopp as its new CEO after an accelerated search in the wake of the takeover threat by Italy's UniCredit. Orlopp is the first woman in the role at the 154-year-old company and finds herself tasked with leading it through one of its biggest challenges, with its future as an independent firm at stake. UniCredit effectively controls 21% of Commerzbank, making it the German lender's biggest shareholder. That stake is bigger than the German government, which opposes a potential takeover. And Caroline Ellison was sentenced to 2 years in prison by a federal judge for her role in crypto firm FTX's collapse. That is despite her cooperation with prosecutors in the case against her former boss and boyfriend, Sam Bankman-Fried. The judge praised her testimony, but said the punishment was needed to deter others from attempting similar fraud. Ellison was also ordered to forfeit $11 billion as proceeds of the crime. And a quick look at equity futures as we head into the European session. We had a better day once more for the S&P yesterday, 41st record high for the year. Today, things are slipping somewhat as we keep a close eye on the developments in the Middle East. Well, that was our show, Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersecci in London. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.